our second session in responsible leadership, and today's particularly nice, happy day because we have the visit of Dr. Emilie Prattico. Dr. Prattico is in terms of introduction, I think it's one of the few persons I know in the field that is a practitioner, an active practitioner, and somebody who is reflective, who writes a book, and you did a doctorate, so it's a nice combination. It's unusual and it's very powerful. And we are honored to have you, and you are going to soon to present officially your book. So it's an avant-premiere, a word avant-premiere, if I'm not wrong. So welcome, Emilie, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Zakari, and thank you very much for such a kind introduction. So I'll say a little bit more about this background, as I think it's relevant to what I'm going to be talking about, which is the new corporate climate leadership. I indeed started out my career as a philosopher, and I have a PhD in philosophy, and in the course of my research, I felt that this was about 10 to 15 years ago now, I felt that the discourse about climate was lacking a political dimension, a dimension about justice. And so that's sort of how I got into the climate field, by recognizing that there were some issues that were, that we would benefit from talking about, and they happen to be very philosophical issues about the distribution of power, the distribution of resources, and that they might help us tackle some of the pressing issues around climate. At the time, I don't know if any of you will remember, but Professor Zakari, maybe you will, because it was, over a decade ago now. 2008, I think, was the year that Al Gore had his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, which frankly was, at once a very momentous milestone in the history of climate and climate action, but also one that I thought revealed the shortcomings of the climate movement at the time and up to very recently, which is that, it was very science heavy, which of course we know that climate is a scientific issue, but we also know that science isn't necessarily an open door to all and can actually sometimes be a barrier to some to discuss these issues. It might also hide some of the issues that climate is actually about, and I already talked a bit about distribution of resources and power, but also his solutions were very individual based. So if we changed our light bulbs, if we stopped using plastic bags, then we might tackle the climate issue. And so that's my starting point in my own journey and in my reflection as to what are we talking about when we talk about climate, and what do we need to do in order to tackle climate. So you'll have understood that my hypothesis is that we don't need to talk about more science, although we do need to talk about science, and we don't need to talk about individuals. We need to talk about systemic issues and systemic solutions, and we need to talk about the collective. And so that's sort of the broad lens that I have when I approach climate in my work. And for the past 10-ish years, I've consulted with large corporations. I've collaborated with multilateral banks and institutions, the UN, the World Bank, so on and so forth. And I've also had the opportunity to think and reflect, as Professor Zakari mentioned, and to write a book called The New Corporate Climate Leadership, which will be out in December. Early December, so you can ask Santa Claus to bring it to you, no problem. It'll be there in time. And so this title, that the new corporate climate leadership, I think is already sort of perhaps telling you a little bit about what I'm trying to achieve there. In fact, this was co-written with a colleague, Edward Cameron. So what we had in mind when we were talking about the new corporate climate leadership is that we recognized that there was a corporate climate leadership, but we want to bring the point home to our readers and to our audience that something has changed since the early days of the climate movement, which have in fact persisted until recently. And we need to rethink leadership when it comes to climate action. What's more, our view is that when we rethink climate leadership, we're actually rethinking climate altogether. So I'll just give you a little bit of background as to sort of what we have in mind as this pre-existing corporate climate leadership that we feel really needed to be changed. And then I'll give you a sense of our outlook for proposed solutions, what we feel is needed to tackle this unprecedented crisis that we are currently facing and that is getting worse daily, in fact. So if you look at the history of the climate movement, I mean, you could go very far back in the 1800s when the science was starting about climate science and measurement of different variations, but we won't do that. What I have in mind is the so-called climate movement that started perhaps in the 70s that really reached its peak in the 80s. And why am I thinking about, what is the date I'm thinking about in the 80s? It's the date when a scientist from NASA, James Hansen, in 1988 went to Congress in the United States to testify that climate change, at the time it was called global warming, was in fact happening, and that political solutions were needed. All right, so this is over 30 years ago, almost 35 years ago today. That's a huge deal, right? It's like out of the universities into Congress, out of NASA, you know, the sort of epitome of a scientific institution into the US Congress, the epitome of where, you know, political decisions are made. Now, if you look back at the past 35 years, or the 30 years, let's say, subsequent to that, up until the Paris Agreement, let's say, you know, just to leave a little bit of room for change nonetheless, what happened? Certainly the climate debate was politicized, that we know, meaning that, you know, people did understand that there were political issues at stake, but it was also polarized. And what was done was that, you know, climate was used as a lever for political ends. And we saw that from politicians, we saw that also from companies. It's now completely open and confirmed that companies lobbied against any form of climate action via, you know, sort of subverting policy efforts and so on and so forth. So I'm thinking, of course, of fossil fuel giants. So, you know, I won't go into those details. Happy to later in the Q&A if you'd like to, but Exxon, Chevron are typically, you know, sort of pilloried for this. And this is confirmed. This is no longer, you know, conspiracy theory land at all, right? This is confirmed, it's proved in court, and so on and so forth. So while sort of the science was brought into politics, it was also subverted. And as a result, very little action actually happened in those 30 years. We knew then a lot of what we know now, even though we know a lot more now, but we knew then that a crisis was looming. We knew then that with every day that inaction happened, the crisis was going to get worse. We knew then that there was an opportunity for positive change. Okay, so all that was known then. I mean, it wasn't only known by James Hansen from NASA, it was known by a large community of nonprofits, of companies, of scientists, and of civil society actors. Nothing was done. And there's many reasons why nothing was done. I mentioned one, which was this politicization and polarization. There was also the belief, the perception that there was a reputational risk to put yourself out there, to use a colloquial term, in terms of climate, that consumers didn't want to hear about climate or about the environment, because at the time, climate discourse was all about reducing your consumption, changing your lifestyle, and companies did not want to propose that to their consumers and to their captive audience. They didn't want to say, please consume less of our products, please consume differently. There was a philosophy of growth that is in fact very present still today. It wasn't just, you know, in the past 30 years that this growth modus operandus was typical of companies. This has, you know, if you look at the history of capitalism, that the outlook on growth has been fairly constant throughout. And I'm also happy to tackle that or any questions about that in the Q&A. So, you know, more growth, more consumption. Companies were not keen to say, okay, we need to consume differently, we need to produce differently. And it might mean that we need to consume less, or that you need to rethink your transport, or you need to rethink how you procure energy, and so on and so forth. So companies saw the reputational risk in taking environmental and climate action. There was also this and that we'll see has probably changed, right? And so climate change was for a long time a case for martyrs, right? Whether it was companies or, civil society actors, those who argued in favor of climate action had a lot of courage, that's certain, but were also in a position of a sort of martyrdom, right? It was, they were prophets that weren't heard in their own country. They were people who were fighting against the grain. And that is very much how the climate movement started. And that is its DNA, even up until today, where, there is this kind of going against the grain is part of the DNA of a lot of civil society organizations around climate. And so you can see that for corporate leadership, that meant that, they were in a very odd position of having to, if they wanted to take climate action seriously, had to align with those civil society organizations that were going against the grain of the mainstream. And for most companies, going against the grain of the mainstream is very difficult, sometimes impossible, represents not only a reputational risk, but just something that leadership will not do for a number of reasons, even beyond mere reputation, but simply appetite for that matter, right? And also very concrete worries about growth, as I just mentioned. Now, if you just take a step back and you can, maybe some of you will remember this, but maybe not. And I'd actually be very interested in hearing from you how you see this later on, because we're not the same age and we haven't learnt about climate in the same way. But, as I was growing up, and I'm in my late 30s, right? So, climate was always a catastrophe, right? If you look at, and I did this, and I have this slide somewhere that I'd be happy to share after this talk. If you look at all the covers of Time magazine that are about climate change, they're all about catastrophe. They're all about the end of the world. They're all about the world is burning, right? So there's this very apocalyptic almost sense about climate change, that we are on a precipice, that we're all going to die horrible deaths due to climate change. If you look at some of the best-selling books, they're also about the sixth extinction. They're talking about nature falling apart. So the spirit is very much one of catastrophe, not one of hope, not one of action, not one of encouragement, but one of, why don't you join us on this kamikaze mission? Because the world is ending anyway, and we'll do the little that we can do in order to perhaps avert the catastrophe a little bit. But there was never a discourse of hope, never a discourse of a positive vision that we might all want to actually be a part of, versus a very negative vision that we are trying to avert at all costs, but we're ultimately failing. So that's where the leadership was, right? That's sort of the context within which leadership was occurring for the longest of times. And I'm going to use the Paris Agreement as the turning point, but that's blurry, and we can discuss that too. I'd be happy to. So up until the Paris Agreement, to be a leader meant to go against the grain of the mainstream and align with what was sometimes perceived as radical civil society organizations, the Greenpeaces of the world, right, not the Oxfams of the world, that were often finger pointers. So it was entering a political arena that was fraught with discord and in fact, covert lobbying and all kinds of murky territory that companies may not have wanted to be a part of openly. And it was part of this very dark vision of the future, right? The world is ending, there's hardly any hope, but we've got to do something. So if you're a company, and that was the discourse or the context within which climate action was occurring, indeed, it did take courage to act. But there wasn't much of a positive program. There wasn't much of an opportunity for companies to say to their audiences and to their stakeholders, and I'm not just talking about consumers here, let's build this new world that we need to build, given the predicament that we're in. Let's change our capital flows. Let's really invest in our supply chains. Let's really think about the vulnerable people that are affected by these, by extreme weather events that, our supply chains are on, and that we might actually make more resilient. It was none of that. It was, as I mentioned, it was in this apocalyptic context that companies were operating. Now, the situation now is different. And I'm going to use the Paris Agreement to say or to try and show what's changed, right? So the Paris Agreement is historic and unprecedented by all measures. Now, you probably have heard, and you probably have yourselves, some criticism of the Paris Agreement. You know, it's not enforceable. Fair enough. That's a pretty big deal, right? It advocated for 2 degrees when the science was already telling us that we needed to be at 1.5 degrees. Okay, also a huge deal, fair enough. Nonetheless, for the first time in history, 194 countries agreed on something, anything, right? Agreed on something. They agreed not only on the goal, but also on some of the mechanisms that were going to help countries get there. In terms of climate specifically, they made progress. They didn't solve, but they made progress on key debates that were stopping and hindering climate action, such as debates about the responsibility of the North to countries of the South, right? Financially. Now, of course, they, through the Paris Agreement, pledged finance to the global South. Now, those pledges have not actually necessarily been honored. So, there are definitely limitations to the Paris Agreement. But for the first time in history, countries came together, agreed on something, a goal that was a positive goal, a progressive goal for the world. And so that's something to build on. And we're currently still building on that. In a couple of weeks, COP26 will start, and that will be sort of the season 2, as it were, of progressive climate policy. After the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow COP will sort of check where we are and how we can raise global ambitions. So the Paris Agreement really set the stage for a lot. What did it do for companies, right? For the first time, companies had a platform where they could be ambitious, push for ambition directly with policymakers, showcase their own ambition and their own actions that they had already taken, and be a part of the solution, right? Oftentimes, as I mentioned prior to that, companies were sort of were perhaps seen as the bad side of climate action, right? That they were the problem, and indeed, a lot of companies are the problem in the sense that they are accountable for GHG emissions and accountable for the use of natural resources. But for the first time during the Paris Agreement and the run-up to the Paris Agreement, there was a mindset shift whereby even if companies are accountable for a majority of carbon emissions, let's say, they are also seen as a potential solution, right? Precisely because of their role in GHG emissions. So just precisely because they are responsible for such important amounts of GHG emissions, they have the levers themselves to change that. And so that was the first time in the history of the climate movement that happened. And that happened thanks to civil society organizations. It happened thanks to companies themselves, very few at the time, a few hundred maybe, really understanding that this is a role that they could take, a leadership role that they could take, right? It was the usual suspects for the most part. Paul Polman was all over COP21, right? So Unilever was really showcased. So was IKEA. I would say those were the two sort of front runners, right, at the time. But they brought with them hundreds of companies, and they really shifted the discourse about what companies can do and what they ought to do, which is slightly different, and what was going to be possible for the next few years. And so in the last 5 years, we're still not there, right? It's not perfect, but there has been this shift that has unlocked a lot of inspiring leadership on the part of companies, and that has helped us move forward towards solving the climate crisis. Now, let me just say as a caveat, we're actually not there at all. We're very late. I mean, I say we, globally, the world is very late. As I said, every day that goes by, it means that the crisis is going to be worse. We are not addressing the issue and the crisis at the right pace. It is too slow. We are not mobilizing the right amounts of finance. There too, we are absolutely late. And it's not looking great, let's say. So not just, I talked about some finance that had been pledged in Paris, but then there's just, the capital flows that are just needed for investments in projects that are going to be more climate friendly or climate adapted, building resilience, changing supply chains, investing in people. That finance is not flowing. So companies are, more aware of a new role that they can take, but there is still a lot of action that needs to be taken, and that was sort of the impetus behind the book, saying a lot has happened, a lot is happening, but we need to push even further and even faster. Nothing less than the total mobilization, right, of the world, of all stakeholders, is going to get us to where we need to get. And companies, being powerful as they are, need to also take on that responsibility, with the awareness that this is a decisive decade. So you might have heard this phrase, it's being used a lot at the moment. We have a lost decade, which is, basically the decade since Copenhagen. So Copenhagen is another UN conference that happened in 2011, where companies made pledges, and then between 2009, sorry, between 2009 and 2018, it was measured that basically nothing had happened in terms of reducing emissions. I say basically, it's a bit more complicated than that, but net, we're at the same position. So that was the lost decade, right? And so now we're in the decisive decade. I mean, these are just phrases that can maybe help you understand the issues, but it doesn't really matter if you don't remember them. But what you will also have heard is that 2030 is a date that is extremely important in the climate movement, as is 2050. And I can just tell you very quickly, basically by 2030, which is at the end of this decisive decade, we need to have reduced our global emissions by 50%, right? Compared to where they were in 2010. 2050 is when we sort of have to make sure that all of our emissions are net positive, meaning that on balance, we're not emitting, so that we're offsetting everything that we're emitting. So, so those are some of the milestone dates. The urgency has never been stronger. And indeed, with every day, I've said this before, but with every day, it just keeps getting stronger and stronger. And so the question is, I've sort of laid out what my view of the context is, but then, I'd like to sort of share with you our view, or my view, of what kind of leadership then is needed, right? So what does it mean to observe all of this and to think about leadership, or to be a leader, right? So, right. So one thing that has emerged and is a positive, right, because I'm going to make it sound like it's a negative, so I want to be very clear that it's a positive. One thing that has emerged is that companies are taking very seriously emissions reductions. And so it would be fair to think that perhaps acting on emissions reductions is a sign of leadership, right? And to a certain extent, it is. Up until about 2013, companies who had emissions reductions targets could not explain how they got them, other than perhaps some internal process based on some kind of baseline and what they thought might be possible. So by this, I mean to emphasize that it was not science-based, right? It was pretty much arbitrary. And this is, you may have heard of CDP as an organization, and they are sort of, the holders of standards for, emissions reductions measurement and so on. And so they did this study that showed that companies, had emissions targets that were arbitrary, that didn't add up to anything, and that weren't contributing to a collective goal that we could, measure their contribution to. Now that has changed, right? Now, a lot of thousands of companies, well, by thousands, more close to 2,000, so I don't want to be misleading here, now have science-based targets for their emissions reductions. That is a huge change, and that is a form of leadership, right? If you're sort of taking the decision to put your company's targets under the helm of a collective goal, that's kind of a risk taking, right? You're no longer just going by your own data and your own measurements, but something that is much bigger than the company. So that's a form of leadership, or at least a form of risk taking. And so I don't want to say that that is insignificant. It's actually huge. But what I do want to say is that it's certainly not enough. Right. Remember that when I started out, I said that to rethink climate leadership is to rethink climate itself. So what is the climate question that we're answering? So the climate question that we're answering, the climate crisis, is certainly a crisis in emissions gone rogue, but it's not only that. It's also a social crisis. And you will have seen that whenever there's an extreme weather event, you can see this in the news yourselves, right? Or you can read it in academic studies, but it's all out there that, the most impacted people are vulnerable communities, right? So that's very clear. It's a social issue. It's a political issue. The decisions that we need made are in the hands of politicians, and they, for some, deny the science, ignore the issues, prioritize other issues. So it's also a political issue. It's an issue about innovation and investment in innovation, right? I'll just to illustrate a small aside. I live in France, as I'm sure most of you do, right? But so recently there was, I think, the French Tech Week, and a few ministers were really, so proud to announce that all these companies had raised hundreds of millions, in whatever rounds that they were in, for these so-called innovative platforms. One was a platform to exchange tickets for events, right? Okay, super helpful and useful. I mean, even though we haven't really been going to events much in the past 18 months, but is that where sort of is that scale of investment for this kind of platform going to help us with the climate crisis? This was sort of a 400 million, I think, euro round of investment. Well, probably not, right? So where's our money going? Where's our innovation going? Where's our thinking? Where's our innovators? Where are they going? So it's an issue about that. And it's an issue about, you could call it a cultural issue. It's an issue where companies are going to have to collaborate. And they're going to have to collaborate with stakeholders that for some they're used to collaborating with, and for some they're not. What's going to certainly be new for all is the way in which they're going to collaborate. So we're going to go beyond commercial interest as the main factor in a relationship with a stakeholder, but rather having this collective goal of averting the climate crisis and of building resilience where you can't avert the crisis, but where you can only just sort of manage the impact of the climate crisis. And so all of these are ingredients towards a new kind of leadership. Now, it's not yet the full picture of the leadership that I want to paint, but it's just to perhaps, show you sort of the direction to which it's going. Right, so, climate change, not just a scientific issue. The fact that companies have taken on science as a criterion for their action is a huge step forward, but really it doesn't quite capture the new predicament of the climate crisis, which is this social, political, cultural, financial crisis, or you could call it more positively revolution that it can be. And so that's how we call upon, I would say, companies, right? It's to lead the change in these areas, right? In these social, political, cultural, financial areas. That is the new corporate climate leadership. And it's possible, and some companies are doing this, and it's certainly new because it goes, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, it's sort of counterintuitive for companies. A lot of companies are very, very careful not to talk about specifically cultural, social, political issues, right? For a lot of leaders, up until recently, taking a stand was a reputational risk. What has changed, and this is not just about climate, and I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to this, so I hope we have time to have a dialogue also about this issue, perhaps. Now the reputational risk is in not taking a stand. Countless studies show that all stakeholders, whether it's employees, whether it's the people you're trying to recruit, but whether it's the communities that you operate in, or politicians even, you know, in some cases, they expect companies to take a stand, right? People don't want to work for a company that doesn't take a stand in something that affects them. And this we saw, and we continue to see in racial issues, right? In gender issues, any kind of sort of issue where there could be discrimination is something that, you know, I think where we can see this even more starkly than where climate is concerned. But also, you know, if you look at the sort of incumbent companies, so fossil fuel companies, just to, you know, agribusiness companies, just to take the most egregious examples of companies that seem to be on the wrong side of the climate crisis, they're having trouble recruiting. That is just a fact. I mean, the figures are out for that as well, and they're trying all kinds of ways to try and find the best talent, because talent doesn't want to serve without purpose, or to serve a purpose that might be counter to your own individual purpose. So now we're seeing that companies have to take a stand. The reputational risk is in not taking a stand on these issues. And so, you know, that's sort of a transformation that is broader than climate, that also has a, I would say, that resonates in climate action as well. But let me just, to be a bit clear, or try to be a bit clear, like, so what are the 4 criteria, according to me, that are part of this new climate leadership for companies? Based on everything I've said, I'm going to try and sort of whittle it down as clearly as possible. So I think now that companies have to be transformational and not tactical, right? So emissions reductions, great. Changing your fleet for, you know, electric cars, great. But that isn't really going to be big enough to tackle the size of the crisis. We're talking about companies, you know, that have global supply chains. Just to answer the question, the example of basically, if you look at Total in France, that's an example of a company that's having a really hard time recruiting. But any of the fossil fuel companies in the US as well, but since we're in France, you can look up Total. But anyway, so, you know, these are companies with global supply chains. These are companies with, hence, power, or you know, in complex systems. So they need to exert that power transformationally and not just tactically. They have to really, and that means, you know, just to be very clear, that means they have to tackle the science, right? So I want to be clear that I'm not, in everything I'm saying, I'm not saying the science isn't important. I'm saying the science is not enough, right? So this is one example of where you would need the science, definitely, in order to understand the systemic impact that you can have within your global supply chain, for instance. You know, that also means, so in this in adopting a transformational outlook, it means that you're going to build resilience in vulnerable communities in your global supply chains, right? So that means that, you know, you might go a little bit further into your stakeholders in order to make sure that, you know, these are stakeholders that can withstand extreme weather events, that have this access to decision making about their own communities, that have access to finance for projects that are going to happen in their own communities to create the resilience that they need, and so on and so forth. So, you know, you could say that to become transformational, these leaders have to think beyond the horizon, really. They have to think into new territory that might be very novel for them and very foreign to them. They certainly have to do that. And so my second point here, and this is related, is that we no longer need only ambition. We need ambition, of course, because, you know, I told you, like, you know, this is the decisive decade for climate action, but we need imagination, right? We need visionaries. We need leaders who are able to take us to places that we don't really know yet. This is where innovation comes in. This is where investment in innovation comes in. And imagination, you know, when I think of the word innovation, it's very technical. When I think of imagination, it's much broader than that. And so I do want to make sure that, you know, you don't take away that I'm talking about just, you know, let's invest lots in innovation. It really is about imagination, creating a new reality. We need nothing less than a new reality if we want to actually get out of this climate crisis, because the current reality won't work. And so that is something that I would say is fairly demanding and fairly new to ask of corporate leaders, but I don't think we can move forward with any less than that. What you need to is something that we've called cathedral thinking. All right, so what's cathedral thinking? Cathedral thinking is thinking, for hundreds or thousands of years. So of course that's, it can sound a bit hubristic and immodest, considering, CEOs on average have a tenure of about 6 years, right? But what's really important to capture here is sort of, the magnitude of climate impacts, the magnitude of the crisis is such that our solutions cannot be short-term. Now, there are going to be short-term solutions. There are going to be tactical solutions, like, that are not only transformational ones. But if we limit ourselves to short-term solutions, even 10 years, even to 2050, frankly, then, it's going to be difficult to set the right foundations for transformation. So that's what we have in mind with cathedral thinking. Cathedral thinking, if you think, if you walk around Paris and you see the Notre Dame, you'll also notice that, to build the cathedral, and in fact, even to rebuild it as we are currently, takes all manner of talents, right? Even talents that we didn't know we would need, right? I'm sure that, after they burnt down, we didn't think we would need the kinds of talents that we're needing now. And so that's also part of cathedral thinking. Who are you engaging with? Who are your stakeholders? Who are your stakeholders of today? Who are your stakeholders of the future? Right. So it's rethinking. Again, it's still related to this thinking beyond the horizon, but this is perhaps the more temporal version of that, right? It's sort of thinking beyond your time horizon for cathedral thinking. And lastly, I would say that this new corporate climate leadership will take courage and patience in a time of urgency. Some of the things I've said, most of what you'll hear in the news, I find to be quite stressful. Right, we only have a decade. The world is ending. Finance isn't flowing in the right ways. Companies aren't reducing their emissions. Countries aren't ambitious enough. All this can be really stressful. There's you'll probably have come across this, or if you haven't, let me tell you, that mental health professionals are now diagnosing climate anxiety and all other manner of disorders that are related to the climate predicament and the climate crisis. So, we need leaders that are resilient and that have virtues like courage and patience and fortitude in the face of this urgency, in the face of what seems like an impossible task. And that's not easy. I would say that's probably the, out of the 4 criteria here that I have, probably the most difficult one to come by. And I use the word virtue, and that's probably why it's difficult, because it's related to the character of the leader as opposed to the actions of the leader. And that could be the topic of a whole other philosophical debate of how we build character. But that, I think, is something to think about as you yourselves are cultivating your own leadership skills and your own characters. What kind of virtues will you have and will you bring to whatever crisis, in fact, you'll be brought to lead on, and not just the climate one. So I'll stop here. I see that there's a question here. I do not have statistics about sort of climate-related psychological troubles, but I see something about this at least once a week in the news, so I'm sure you can Google it, but I can also send Professor Zakari some resources after this session about this.
Thank you, Emilie. Well, please feel free to pose your questions. It's a nice occasion to pose questions.
I have a little question, please.
Yes.
So, of course, every little step is very important, but we know that some companies and countries have a huge impact. So when we are working for a small company, do we really need to, we can think that we shouldn't give 100% to have the least environmental impact, but should we do it also?
Okay, so thanks for your question, Victor. If I understand you correctly, you're saying, there's huge actors that have a huge impact that aren't really doing their quote unquote fair share. So as a smaller actor, what do you do? Well, that's where, some of these traits of the leader come in, right? It's I talked about thinking beyond the horizon, so beyond your your own sort of borders. I mean, metaphorical borders. Cathedral thinking about your stakeholders very differently. And having courage as well. So you can have courage by leading the way. So I think that if you think about these three things, at least, and if you think even about imagination as the fourth, that means that you're no longer thinking about, oh, well, I'll reduce my little corner here and hope that it's okay. But rather you're seeing yourself as, I'll do everything I can, even beyond the purview, the strict purview of my company. I'm going to go and explore in my supply chain what I can do. And I need to, build resilience in this community. So how about I go and talk to a policymaker and see if there's anything that can be done there? So, the self-limiting of, well, I'm only small compared to these big guys. Well, you don't know. I mean, one of the leaders in CSR was a carpet company that was not a multinational at the time, Interface. I don't know if all of you know about Interface. They were a relatively small company. They changed the face, sorry, I didn't mean to repeat that, but they changed the face of sustainability and CSR and how we think about, or what is, they opened a whole field of possibles for being a sustainable company. Okay, so you have a case with Interface. So they're not huge by any standard. They're not Exxon. They're not Cemex or what have you. They're relatively small. So I hope that answers your question, Victor. I also see Siki and Aditi shared some questions. So we need imagination, visionaries, examples of companies that are innovative in this way. It's difficult. I mean, there's the usual suspects, right? There's Unilever for sure, but that's limited. I would say that Ben & Jerry's, which are part of Unilever, but we're independent. I think they have some interesting vision. I don't actually think there are many companies that have the vision or any leaders that display that vision. You might find some, and perhaps you guys are better versed in this than I am, but you might find some in smaller startups, perhaps perhaps in the tech world. But in the corporate world, I'm not thinking of many visionaries. I don't think of space travel as visionary, right? To refer to maybe some things that we've seen in the news recently. I don't think of, I don't think so. So I don't actually have examples for that. So I'm sorry, but I don't think it's my fault, right? I think it's precisely because we need to see that. What's my take on the ideology that developed nations need to take the lead on climate issues as opposed to the developing ones? I mean, the fact is that is a hugely debated issue amongst countries. So I don't think that my take can solve it, right? And so for those of you who aren't necessarily aware of this, there is this, and if you wanted to look it up yourselves, you could look up loss and damage. That's sort of the technical term for this debate, loss and damage. The idea is that the victims of climate change, those that are the most impacted, are actually those that are the least responsible for it. And the flip side of that is countries that are the most responsible for it, i.e. the global north, is some of the least impacted by it. That's starting to change. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but at least it's sort of evening out somewhat. My take is that there is definitely a question of justice. I mentioned this at first. What is owed to whom and by whom? And certainly the just thing to do is that those that are accountable for and responsible for things like emissions or extractions, resource extraction that has endangered biodiversity and natural habitats and so forth, they definitely, they ought to certainly bear the larger brunt of things. The fact is that we are now all confronted with an unprecedented global crisis. So I think we all have an interest in solving it now. When it comes to capital flows and finance and investment, there is definitely some asymmetries that could be corrected. That's for sure. But in terms of, should we all be urged to act? I don't think we can get there if we don't all act. So we can't wait for those who are more responsible to act. But we can certainly pressure them to act in certain ways or encourage them very strongly to act in certain ways.
So you had, I'm so sorry, thank you for your presentation. But you talked about how companies sort of need to shift from like a tactical way to deal with the climate issue versus like a transformational sort of outlook. Could you sort of furnish us with a concrete example on how to like what would be the difference between like a tactical versus a transformational action?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, when I refer to tactical thinking around climate, on the whole, I'm going to be thinking about emissions reductions. I don't know if you're familiar with Scope 1 and Scope 2 and those differences, but, you know, that's going to be sort of what most companies are going to be doing. And at the moment, and, you know, if any of you have any contact with any environmental consultants, you'll see that they're very, very busy because companies are suddenly waking up to the fact that they need to measure and reduce their emissions. Now that I call tactical. You know, it's sort of, they have there's a task and they're going to accomplish it. And that's great. And we need that. You know, again, I don't want to sound, and I want to be very clear, we do need to reduce emissions drastically. So we need companies to do that, but that is tactical. When you're thinking more transformationally, you're adding on to that. You're also building resilience in the communities that you operate in and beyond, right? So what does it mean to build resilience for these communities? It means to provide them with access to decision-making. So you could call it a form of democratization, right? So that there's sort of more involved, but also there is a sort of accountability of their own decisions by themselves. And that leads to access to power, right? They need to have not energy, right? Political power. They need to have power over their own communities and the projects that they want to engage in and how they're going to be engaged and so on and so forth. It also means for a lot access to certain forms of education. And that's going to often be accompanied by the worry that this access is equal. In a lot of vulnerable communities that are impacted by climate change, you know, we have observed that there's also gender inequality, and so oftentimes women don't have the education necessary to be resilient against the impacts of climate change. So that's going to be one other aspect. You're going to want to create access to finance as well in order to build some autonomy for these people and just simply some resilience to bounce back once they have been affected by the impacts of climate change. So that's how you're going to build resilience. You're going to also think transformationally. You're also going to build inclusion. I've already mentioned that, you know, as you're building resilience, you also want to make sure that it doesn't discriminate, you know, on gender, but it's also on race or on age, what have you. You want to make sure it's inclusive, that you're tackling these issues with communities inclusively. Arguably, and again, this could be the object of another very long conversation, arguably some of the reasons why we are where we are, and I talk about this in the book, is because we had a very exclusionary model of growth and a very exclusionary model of capitalism, never mind of actual politics, right? So, you know, by being more inclusive, you're going to reduce inequality. You're also going to, you know, create conditions where you can build resilience, and from there, you're going to help people manage what is unavoidable, manage what is coming, right? So some of the climate impacts that you know we know are coming, and we cannot avoid them. So that's one way that you can do this. But you're also going to be investing in people in a way that they might actually, by having such a deep knowledge of their communities, of their land, of their cultures, of their societies, they will also have solutions, you know, to perhaps, you know, further mitigation even more, meaning, you know, reduce emissions in better ways, in ways that don't have sort of this double-edged sword negative impact kind of thing. So that's one way, and I would say, well, or I should say there's many ways in which you can think transformationally, right, as opposed to just tactically.
Emilie, there was some comment about in the chat about this the global south is very wide. I mean, but well, I come from a country in Latin America, and sometimes there's the idea that we need to develop fast. Growth is important because many people have to exit from poverty, and this is a fact. At the same time, this growth has to be done differently, and maybe we don't have there's no resources to make this growth in a different way.
Yes, I do agree, and actually, yeah, that sort of resonates with the last comment there in the chat that we can't just replicate sort of the form of capitalism that we've seen, or even, as I said, the any form of social and political organization that we've had that has led us here. I would say that for a lot of countries of the global south actually represents an opportunity, but I also don't want to sound naive, right? Because I think there are also sort of there are also issues about resources, other social issues that might have to be tackled before we can rethink some of the governance around climate in these countries. So I do think that some countries and perhaps even some companies in the global south can come out as leaders. But I don't want to be naive about that. I do think we should encourage that. I do think we should look for that. I do think we should invest in that. I just want the caveat just being that, let's not be too let's take off the rose-tinted glasses, because actually the situation is such that the power dynamics between the North and the South aren't necessarily conducive today to that emerging, unfortunately.
So during the conversation, during your talk, I think you talked about how different age groups are sort of presented with the talk of climate in different ways. So you were presented a very apocalyptic this thing, and you wanted to know what different age groups were. So for me, I mean, I just here sharing the sort of spirit of sharing. I was introduced to the climate as a topic back when we were 12 years old, and the school board decided that it was important to introduce environmental education as a subject. So we were presented with a lot of what you'd call tactical ways to sort of contribute to lesser consumption and better utilization of the resources at hand, but also all the past movements that a lot of people had been sort of scared to take up, a lot of local movements. So there was a lot of awareness that was created. So I think for me, at least, or for my age group, I think there has been a good amount of awareness, but also with recent books the Bill Gates How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, it's a lot of actionary items on there that this is a very decisive action that can be taken to mitigate anything he talks about the 31% emissions that can be sort of focused on just from steel and plastic production or things of that sort. So I think it's slightly, there's some hope to the discourse for me, at least.
Thanks for sharing that. That's fascinating, and it's definitely progress, right? That you were presented with hope and action. It's not quite what was the case, a decade or so before. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you a lot, Emilie, for your visit. Well, we are now running out of time, but well, thank you a lot for your time, for having visited us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I hope you took something out of this. I remain available if you have any questions. I'll follow up with you, Professor Zakari, because there's a couple of things I'd maybe want to share, just little things that might sort of illustrate what I was saying.
Great, with pleasure. Yes, please feel free to. And I'm looking forward to read the book. I have it in my list for Santa Claus list.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just a word to students. So thank you for having been here. I have no particular comment for about the course. I think it's going very well, and if there's any doubt, I remain after the closing a few seconds if anybody has any doubt about the course itself.